Well, hi there. So this is our last lecture that we're going to do about factor markets. And in this video, we're going to talk about a special type of factor market, an imperfectly competitive factor market called a monopsony. Now, a pure monopsony is a market in which there's one buyer. It's a little bit of the flip side of what a monopoly is. Right? A monopoly is one seller. A monopsony is one buyer. Now, in practice, we don't see very many that are really purely one buyer of a product. It's pretty rare. But we do have markets where there's not very many, and we would call those monopsonistic markets, where there's not very many buyers of the product, and it still behaves pretty similarly to what we would see with monopolistic competition. We have the kind of distortion of the market, and we actually end up with a market failure. So a monopsony in terms of our pure example would be like, for example, one buyer of maybe labor. The oldest example in the book is a coal mining town. So a coal mine town. And in the coal mine town, everybody works for the mine. Everybody works for either the mining company store or they work for the mining company housing. They might work for the local mining company security force. Everybody works for the mine. And so there's only one buyer of labor in that case. There aren't that many of those kinds of towns anymore. But what is actually relatively common are labor markets where there's only one or two firms, very few firms, that are hiring a certain subtype of certain subtype of workers. That would be something like maybe a truck stop town where there's only a handful of employers, right? You've got maybe one or two fast food restaurants, maybe a gas station. And so if you have a really very few number of buyers of labor in that particular labor market, they start to take on these monopsonistic distortions. And again, we're going to see what that looks like in just a second. But what it really does is it causes the workers, right? So the end result, right? We're going to put that right here at the top. End result is lower wages and too few hired. So we would say that this is kind of the opposite of what a monopoly does. A monopoly charges too high of a price and underproduces. And what a monopsony does is they actually pay too little of a wage or they pay too low of a price and they don't buy enough. And so it's kind of a similar problem to what a monopoly has. Again, I'll say that one more time because I think it's so important to notice the parallels in this. That a monopoly charges too high of a price and they buy too few, whereas a monopsony charges or buys for too low of a price. Basically, they're only willing to pay a very low price and they buy too few. And in the case of a labor market, that would be like a firm paying its workers way too low of a wage compared to what would be competitive, and they're not hiring enough workers. So the reason why that is because MFC is greater than the wage. That's why this is going to occur. And it's the exact same kind of corollary, right? Corollary is the idea that marginal revenue is not equal to demand and the price anymore. And so when you have, for example, the marginal factor cost is different from the wage, then you're going to have the same problem that we had when we had marginal revenue kind of coming down separately from a demand curve. And so it is useful to kind of use that in your mind as a way of explaining what's happening here. Now imagine that you have basically a supply curve, and it's going to be described by this supply schedule. That's what these first two columns are. The quantity of labor that people are willing to supply and the various wages that they're willing to actually come out and do the job for. So for example, if the wage is $1, there's only one person who's willing to work. If there's $2 is the wage, then two people are willing to work. $3 is the wage, $3 is willing to work, or three people are willing to work. And what we're going to do here is just calculate some numbers off to the side to show that if the firm basically that's doing the buying of the labor is buying from a supply curve that's upward sloping, then they're going to run into this problem where actually as they pay the higher wage to hire the next worker, the actual cost of that worker is going to go up faster than what just the wage did. It's the same problem that we said in order to sell additional units from the monopoly, they had to lower the price, causing the marginal revenue to fall faster than what the decreases in price were. It's just going the opposite direction. So the total cost if we hired one worker, again, I'll show this to you and then we'll graph it. It's a little bit easier to understand. The total cost is $1 because it's just one worker times $1. But the total cost of hiring two workers is $4. Two workers at $2. That's immediately apparent, usually students. And so we would say, well, we went from 0 to 1 for the first worker, so the additional cost was just 1 for that first worker because we didn't have any workers before we hired them. But when we hired the second worker, the cost wasn't the $2 that we paid them. The cost was $3 to hire that second worker. And that's because we had to pay the first worker $1 more. We are a single wage monopsonist. It means that we only pay our workers one wage. Now, if we could get away with what we call wage discrimination, which is convincing this first person to work for $1 and the second person to work for $2, then we wouldn't have this problem. It's the same idea of price discrimination for the monopoly. However, at the same time, it's illegal for me, the monopsony, to tell my employees, hey, you can't talk about your wages. And oftentimes, though, employers will often still try, right? They'll try to persuade their workers, don't talk about wages. It's not good. And the reason they're doing that is because they're trying to wage discriminate. They're trying to basically pay people who are willing to work for less a little bit less. And that actually eliminates this problem. I digress a bit here. So 9, and continue on this process, filling these out, right? And then 16 and 7, and then 25 and 9. And so you can see that the marginal factor cost of each worker is higher and higher every time than what the wage is. And again, that's simply because we have to pay the previous workers up the food chain. We have to increase their pay when we go to hire, say, the fourth worker for $4. So that means that when we graph a monopsony labor market, we have this quantity and we have a wage, we're going to have an upward sloping supply. And that's going to tell us the wage that the workers are paid. But there's going to be a higher value that's the MFC. And that MFC is basically the same idea as that marginal revenue. And we're going to have the same marginal revenue product, that is to say the demand for labor, that's coming up and coming back down again. And again, that's because the little increase here is because the workers are specializing, so they're getting a little bit more marginal product from each worker. And then there's diminishing marginal returns, which causes basically the MRP to fall as the marginal product of each worker gets less and less as you hire more workers. Now, they hire where MRP equals MFC. And so they hire this quantity right here. That's the quantity they hire, QF, and they pay down here on the wage, right? They pay the supply curve. So this is the wage the firm pays. But what would it be if it were optimal, right? Optimal or competitive is another way to say that. What would it be if it were competitive? And we can look at that and say, well, it would be where supply and demand are. And you can see that here, this would be the optimal or competitive market. And you can see that if this were a competitive labor market with more firms that were hiring, they would actually hire more workers at a higher wage. And so this leads to what we call deadweight loss, right? There's deadweight loss here in this market. And it's basically the lost value of those hirings that should have happened. But this monopsony is not hiring enough workers and it's underpaying the ones that it actually does. Now we're going to actually show how an intervention in this market could fix it. Just as we could fix, in often cases, monopoly problems with a price ceiling, you can actually fix a monopsony problem with a price floor. And so the way that we would solve the problem that we've just kind of set up for you is to say, well, you've got this wage problem. That's our wage, right? The supply curve, MFC, and then MRP. And we know that the firm wants to hire this number of workers and pay them this low wage, right? That's what they would do all by themselves. But what we just do is we put in a price floor, right? A minimum wage. And when we do that, then the W min becomes a new MFC. It'd be nice if I could write today. So this new minimum wage that you would put in, you would say, well, we're going to put it right here at the optimal. And the reason we would choose the optimal is because that's what we want them to be paying their workers. They're going to go as low as they can, so we're going to put it right there at that optimal. And that causes every single worker to get hired for W min, which means the marginal factor cost for every single worker is now W min. And so the firm will actually profit maximize or cost minimize. It'll hire the right number of workers for itself, where the new MFC, that's this W min, where it equals the MRP, and that would occur here at the Q opt. And so that would happen if we actually put in a minimum wage. I know that it sounds really counterintuitive, but by putting in a minimum wage, you can actually cause people to get paid more and have more of them getting jobs. And so it's a little bit of a kind of an astounding theoretical outcome, but it actually has been borne out in empirical research. So if you're feeling like minimum wages, right, there's this kind of one story in economics where they're told as leading to unemployment, and that's the perfectly competitive labor market. But in imperfectly competitive labor markets like monopsonies, then minimum wages can actually cause more people to get jobs at higher wages. And it's a critically important kind of learning outcome to really see the real world. So hopefully this helps you a little bit understanding monopsonies. I'll see you next time.